Okay, good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the second chapter of this report, which is joint work with Hilal Rapoport and Sulin Sazoshau, who is a PhD student at the Paris School of Economics. So we just heard that the labor market impact of immigration tend to be relatively small, especially if you look at the longer run impacts. There is some distributional consequences, but overall these effects tend to be rather limited. However, we still see, and we have this general perception that immigration, especially immigration in recent year and also the recent refugee situation in 2015, created a strong political backlash in the population. So it's very important to understand this potential political backlash better. Is this something that really happened? Is this something that's based on maybe a misperception, mixing up correlations and causal relationships? And if we find such a relationship, what are the reasons for it, and what are the policy consequences that result from it? To give you an overview of what I'm talking about today is, first I'd like to speak a little bit, very short, since it overlaps also with what Anthony said about the methods we use to study the effects of immigration on attitudes and on voting behavior, and then go into stepwise, first look at, okay, what should we think, which factors influence natives' attitudes towards immigration, and then how does that translate into attitudes for, into preferences for policies, and especially we look here at policies for redistribution, and also how does it impact on voting behavior. And here we are particularly interested in voting behavior for populist parties, for parties with very strong anti-immigration agendas. And then let me conclude with saying a little bit more about attitudes towards asylum seekers and the political consequences of the recent asylum seeker inflow. In terms of research methods, I would say there is two broad strands of research. One is that we use survey data, cross-country data, or data from within one country, where we collect information on attitudes of the population, on their personal situation, which allow us, on the one hand, to create descriptive statistics, so we know how many people would favor closed borders versus open borders and so on. But then we can go beyond such simple descriptive statistics, and if we, for example, combine surveys with experiments within those surveys. So one example I will show you at the very end is a survey that asked respondents in many European countries whether they would favor giving asylum to a certain individual. And what the researchers did is they randomly varied the characteristics of this individual. So once the individual was described as high-skilled versus low, or having just low level of education. So by varying certain aspects, randomly varying certain aspects of this description, researchers were able to tease out attitudes towards different types of asylum seekers. The other type of research uses more what also Anthony mentioned in the labor market situation, structural estimation approaches. So we build a formal economic model, which of course is based on many assumptions, but that allow us to tease out certain parameters which you might be interested in. The second type of studies, again, similar to what we heard in the labor market context, use variation in the spatial distribution of immigrants, right? So to put it a bit bluntly, we ask the question, how do attitudes and voting behavior differ in places where there is many immigrants to places where there is few immigrants, right? This type of study is based on the idea that most of the mechanisms we have in mind that might affect the attitudes of the population actually require some sort of geographic proximity between natives and immigrants, natives and asylum seekers. So it makes sense to compare places with more and less immigrants. However, there again we have a very similar problem as in the case when we try to look at labor market consequences. We have to disentangle a so-called selection effect. So the places where immigrants settle down is not random. That might be they settle where the economy is doing particularly well. It might be they settle in neighborhoods with a particularly cheap housing stock. They might settle in places where the attitudes of natives are already fairly positive towards them. So any kind of raw correlation we see between the share of immigrants and attitudes to immigrants or voting for anti-immigration party might be a result of the fact that immigrants just concentrated in certain places. So we try to disentangle this selection into certain neighborhoods, certain municipalities, from really a causal impact of a higher immigration share on attitudes and on voting behavior. So this is really the big empirical challenge that most of the studies that try to study the effect of immigration on voting and attitudes have to overcome. And this is very similar to studies that use spatial distribution of immigrants to tease out the effect on labor market consequences. First, what do we have in mind? Which factors do we have in mind that might shape the attitudes of natives towards immigrants, towards immigration policies? And broadly speaking, we can distinguish two types of factors, right? There is, on the one hand, economic factors. So natives might be concerned about increased competition on the labor market, so they might be concerned about negative consequences for their own wages if they face increased pressure, increased competition on the labor market. There might also be fiscal concerns, right? Natives might be concerned that increased immigration, in particular refugee migration, increases the fiscal burden, which might come at the expense of higher taxes for themselves or reduced benefits for themselves, right? So together we can also say, well, these economic concerns might also mean that natives have some fear of downward social or downward income mobility because of immigration. On the contrary, we have cultural concerns. So the native population might have a taste or a distaste for living in a society, in a culturally or ethnically diverse society. That might come along with kind of opposition to changes in the population changes of the population in the neighborhood, at the workplace, in the school of the children. So it might be that just this preference for living in this homogeneous society increases or creates some backlash against immigration. And researchers have looked at that, and this is mainly studies that use this structural approach, and there the kind of general finding tends to be that these cultural concerns outweigh the economic concerns. So a study by Carr, Dustman, and Preston from 2012 tries to put a number on that, and they say cultural concerns are 2 to 5 times more important in explaining attitudes towards immigration policies than concerns over wages and taxes. These studies do not conclude that economic concerns do not play any role at all, but the general finding is that these cultural concerns actually outweigh the economic concerns, which of course has important implications for the type of policies that we plan to make in order to increase the acceptance of certain immigration levels in the population. It's also the case that these cultural concerns explain most of the difference in attitudes towards immigration that we see by educational levels, which tend to find that individuals with higher levels of education are more open to more immigration, and individuals with lower levels of immigration favor more restrictive policies. And it also seems that this is mainly driven by different preferences, over the cultural mix of the population, and not so much by economic concerns. So if we go on and think about how this translates into preferences for policies, well, there have been two, in terms of how this affects especially preferences for redistributional policies, two aspects has been put forward. The one is what is called the loyalty effect. Well, my willingness to redistribute, especially if I'm on the paying side, might be greater towards individuals from my own ethnic and cultural group. So if the share of individuals from different ethnic and cultural groups increases, this might decrease my willingness to support redistributive policies. The other hand, the other aspect is, well, I would also think about how immigration affects myself, and if I think immigration might have adverse effects on my own economic situation, I might be more in favor of redistributive policies, right? So to sum up, we could think whether immigration, how immigration changes preferences for redistributive policies depends on how much I think the recipient deserves receiving such redistribution, and how much I think I'm personally affected by these redistributional policies and by immigration. The empirical evidence on this is, there is not too much, but the studies that we have tend to find that if the share of immigrants goes up, we have one study here, a cross-country study, if the share of immigrants go up, there is less support for redistributional policies. So this is a study that uses this European Social Survey. However, it turns out that this effect is not true for immigration in general, but it very much depends on the type of immigrants. So this effect is found to be smaller for immigrants from culturally close countries, for immigrants from relatively rich countries, and it's also the case that immigrants, if there is more if the immigrants have higher levels of education, we might even observe an opposite effect. And another study that just looks at Sweden, which puts a bit more emphasis on disentangling this selection effect from the causal effect, comes to a similar conclusion and also finds in overall there is more immigration leads to higher levels or lower levels of support for redistributional policies. If we look at voting behavior directly and the level of immigration and the share of support of voters who support far-right populist parties, we see that there is a fairly strong positive relationship in European countries. So this here just looks at changes in the share of immigrants. So what happens if the share of immigrants goes up? What happens to the share of votes that go to right-wing populist parties? And we see across European countries, if we look at this figure, there is a rather strong positive relationship, as this is been brought forward by this paper, very recent paper by Martin Haller, Alexander Wagner, and Josef Zweimüller. However, again, this is just a correlation, right? So we see there is this positive association, but that might have a variety of different reasons. So many studies have then gone to a more local level and compared really at the municipality level, municipalities that received more immigrants compared to municipalities that received fewer immigrants. However, it tends to be the case that even in those studies where we can do a better job in disentangling the causal effect from the selection effect, we also tend overall to find a positive effect of increased immigration on the one hand center-right parties, so this is an example from a paper from Italy, and also far-right parties that define themselves with strong anti-immigration platforms. So there is examples from Germany, from Denmark, from Austria, from the UK. What we do find also in these studies is most authors conclude that these cultural concerns play a larger role in explaining this positive effect than economic concerns. One maybe notable exception is also a very recent paper by Becker and Fetzer who look at the effect of the inflow of Eastern European workers into the UK. They also find that this increased the support for the UKIP party, and they also found that this increased support for exit votes in the Brexit referendum. They tend to place a little bit more weight on the economic factors that might have influenced this decision. However, also here it's worth pointing out, in general, all these studies find this is not a uniform effect. Whether we find a positive effect or this, so that it increases, more immigration increases support for far-right parties, very much depends on the composition of the immigrants. And it depends a lot on the skill composition on the immigrants. So most of these studies conclude that it's mostly the low-skilled immigration that increased the support for far-right parties, versus immigration of more educated people has no such effect, or even the opposite effect. It's also, and this is another study that looks at refugee immigration to Denmark, it also depends on the characteristics of the places the refugees go. So this study for Denmark, for example, finds that in cities, if refugees were placed in neighborhoods, that decreased the support for the far-right party, whereas on the countryside, it increased the support for the far-right party. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, and it would be wrong to kind of have an overall conclusion what immigration does to attitudes and far-right voting. It very much depends on the context, meaning on the characteristics of the refugees and the places they go to. So there is not a lot of research yet on the current refugee situation, so I'm gonna speak a little bit about one of my own studies that is a case study about state elections in an Austrian state in Upper Austria that took place in September 2015, so really at the height of the refugee inflow in 2015. So Upper Austria here highlighted in green was directly on what became known as the Balkan route. So a lot of the refugees that came in this year, they came via Turkey, Greece, and then via the Balkan states, they moved through Austria, some stayed in Austria, many continued on to Germany and beyond. So what we see in Upper Austria is very much in line overall with these other studies. So what you have here, what you see is, on the one hand, the solid line is the share, the number of asylum applications per month. So you really see how that took off in 2015. And what you also have, that the triangle is the election results of the Freedom Party in the state elections. So in 2009, they had about 15% of the votes. In 2015, they doubled this vote share to more than 30%. And here, the blue circles show you how they did in opinion polls, so we can really track how the support for the Freedom Party changed over time. So we have a very fine-grained measure. And what you see is it's really, this support remained fairly stable until the end of 2014, and then really went up in parallel with the increase, with the number, as the number of asylum applications increased. So overall, even though this is just a relationship over time, there is a strong evidence that suggests that in this example here, the increase in the number of asylum applications had a positive overall, a fairly positive overall effect on the support for the Freedom Party, who really campaigned on an anti-asylum, anti-immigration platform. What you also see here, and that's the dotted line, the salience of the refugee situation in the media, and that's the number of newspaper articles that somehow refer to the asylum situation, is strongly correlated to the number of refugees that come in. So as the number of refugees go up, so does the number of newspaper articles. So this topic is really very salient in the media. However, what makes this Upper Austrian case so interesting, at least to me, is this exposure that voters in Upper Austria had can be divided into three types of exposure. On the one hand, we have what I call a macro level exposure. So without ever meeting a refugee, you just had to open a newspaper, turn on a TV, open social media websites. You were exposed to the refugee situation. You saw what was going on, maybe in an objective manner, maybe the information you got were somehow distorted as well. On top of this macro level exposure, there were two types of what I would call micro level exposure. So at the time of the election, we had 42% of the municipalities hosted asylum seekers there. So these voters, native voters who lived in these municipalities, had on top of the macro level exposure also likely immediate experiences with refugees. That might be just observation, it might go as far as personal interactions. You might also think that there is at the local level some competition for economic resources, but there is this additional layer of exposure to the situation. And I should mention that there was really a lot of effort by local authorities and NGOs in these municipalities to foster interaction between natives and the asylum seekers by holding welcome events, by introducing asylum seekers in their municipality newspapers, and so on. So this is really an environment where we see there is interaction, and this interaction is facilitated by authorities. There is then a third type of 1 minute left, okay. The third type of exposure is many refugees just transited to Germany, and the border communities, the communities that border to Germany, they had this additional very short-term exposure to many, many refugees who just walked through their municipalities, basically. So what I find in my paper is that these municipalities that hosted asylum seekers, actually, there we see a negative effect on the support for the Freedom Party. So there we see a reduction in the vote share for the Freedom Party by about 3.5 percentage points, whereas the short-term exposure in the border communities seem to increase the support for the Freedom Party. Right? So it very much depends on the type of exposure that you have, but the good news here, I think, is, at least to me, it looks that there is scope for policies that try to foster interaction between natives and immigrants, or natives and asylum seekers, to actually mitigate potential backlashes. Okay, I stop in a second. This is the last graph I wanted to show you because I think it is of high policy relevance. This is from one of these survey experiments. And what the authors there did, they asked 18,000 European citizens whether they would favor, for the distribution of asylum seekers, the status quo or the proportional allocation system that has been proposed by European Commission. And what they did, and I think that's the interesting part, before they asked this question, so part of the sample received the information what that would mean for their own country, whether that would actually imply that they would receive more or less refugees than under the status quo. So what you see here, that in most countries, there is a support for a proportional allocation system, even after, so that's if you are to the right here of the zero, even after individuals were told what that would mean for their own country. There is just 3 exceptions. So we have Czech Republic, Poland, and the UK. There was a support for the proportional allocation system if individuals were not informed what that would mean for their own country. Individuals that were informed about the consequences then kind of showed this negative, were stronger opposing the proportional allocation. Okay, so overall, yes, it looks like there is a positive effect of higher immigrant shares on anti-immigrant sentiments and support for anti-immigration policies and platforms. And it seems that this is really driven by cultural concerns. However, it's very important to keep in mind that there is a lot of effect heterogeneity, and it depends very much on the composition of the immigrant population, whether we see such a backlash. And it also looks that there is room for policies to mitigate such concerns, but these policies need not only address economic concerns of the population, but they are it's very important to address these cultural concerns and foster the social and cultural integration of immigrants. Okay, I'll stop here.